Hey everyone, welcome to .NET Conf, and I'm April Yoho, and in this session, we're going to be talking about GitHub Copilot, and we're going to go beyond tips and tricks. So if you've used GitHub Copilot, this is a great time to just not learn how to just prompt it with little simple prompts. We're going to take a deep dive in how to use GitHub Copilot, specifically around .NET and C# code. So let's dig in. So first off, I want to talk about life as a developer. When I started writing code, I thought I was going to get to write code all the time. But the reality is we only get to write code for probably a few hours a day. Those of you that get to write code 8 to 12 hours a day, you're pretty lucky. But the reality is, as a developer, we're waiting on others. We're waiting on compute. We're waiting on access. We have meetings. We have stand-ups. We have all sorts of other things in our day-to-day life, which means we're only spending about 25% of our time writing code. And oftentimes when we're trying to get started on a project, we have to count in the time it takes to get geared up into a project, or maybe we're working in an unfamiliar code base. So we're going to talk about some of the developer tooling and how GitHub Copilot can help us with that, and hopefully take that time that we only get to code, maybe that's 25% of the time, and make it a lot more effective. So the first thing I want to talk about is GitHub as a platform. Now, this is no longer the GitHub of old. So if any of you out there have been using GitHub since, 2008, you might remember it was just source control. That was it. And when you used GitHub back then, you pushed some code up, it stored your code, but we've now delivered an end-to-end platform to you as a developer. And with that, we have some pretty cool tools behind it, and you're going to see AI along every step of the way. But it's really important to talk about the GitHub platform because we're not just writing code and pushing code up anymore. We're delivering software with GitHub. So with that, it starts with how we collaborate. Now, I always joke with people, I speak two languages, American English and British English, and they are very, very different languages. So with that, how we collaborate and the teams we work with, we all have different language backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different age groups, all sorts of different things that play into how we collaborate. So how do we level set that? By being able to use AI to help us level set how we collaborate and some of this tooling, and that's using tools like pull requests and even being able to maybe translate. And we're going to see some of that today. But then also as a developer, because we have very little time to actually write code, how can we be more productive? So using things like GitHub Actions to automate things within our repositories and in our projects is really critical. But underpinning all of this is security. So everything we're going to do today and everything we're going to talk about is secure by design from day one, because security is at the forefront of every single one of our minds and our organization's minds when we execute a project. But then we also think about how GitHub will help us scale. Whether you're a small organization or you're working in a large enterprise, you have to think about how you scale this across your teams, but also how you learn to scale yourself in the future. So as we get into the different parts of the GitHub platform in a few minutes, I want to talk about GitHub Copilot. So I always like to ask people, who's using GitHub Copilot? Who's been on the journey since day one? GitHub Copilot is almost 3 years old now. We're coming up on 3 years old, and has been the most widely adopted AI developer tool in history. And it's set there and it's really transformed over time. So if you've used it in line and had it just kind of make code suggestions and tab through, kind of in the old days of GitHub Copilot a couple of years ago, you tab through the options. You didn't necessarily understand why it was giving you the answer, and you couldn't really explain it. And there was just a lack of learning. So you weren't always sure if maybe what you're accepting was potentially where you wanted to go with it. It was really good at helping us write code faster, but we knew we could do better. So I want to take a step back and talk about why are we building AI and why are we investing this? Because at GitHub, we care about developer happiness. And you think, well, that's a silly metric, but we have to measure success. And if any of you have ever worked in the DevOps space or just even with software delivery, you have to measure the time it takes you to deploy new features and also improvement life cycles. But we're measuring developer happiness because honestly, has anyone ever left a job because they loved it? Probably not. When we're happy developers, we're writing better code, we're more effective at our jobs, and we're more creative, we're having fun, and we're given that space and freedom to do what we love to do best, write code. So we like to measure developer happiness because we know you have limited time. So we want to increase that. We've also taken some metrics to show this effectiveness with GitHub Copilot. So these metrics have changed a little bit over time, but when we launched GitHub Copilot, we found that developers were delivering code over 55% faster with GitHub Copilot. They were able to stay in the flow. And this is my favorite number, is the 73% staying in the flow. As I've kind of been in the industry for a long time, I have really struggled with context switching. And remember, if we're only given 25% or less of our time to write code, we're constantly switching context. Whether we're working remote or in an office, we're in meetings, someone just comes up and taps us on the shoulder. Be able to stay in the flow, write better code, and deliver more effectively is really critical. So this is actually one of my favorite numbers. And then we also found that 75% are more fulfilled in their jobs. And what does that mean? They want to learn, they want to write better code. And hopefully we have more longevity within our customers because they are more happy in their job. They are writing better code and we're delivering features faster. So these are really good numbers that we use to measure the success of GitHub Copilot. If you want to read more, you can go to the Space Framework documentation that we have. You can have a look at your favorite search engine and look up the Space Framework and look at some of the other metrics that you and your organizations can use to look at GitHub Copilot and the success of it. So let's take a look at GitHub Copilot and where it's kind of evolved. So coding in your natural language. Now, I'm speaking American English most of the time, but often I work with folks in Europe or across the world, and English is a second language. So just being able to have that ability to speak to GitHub Copilot in your natural language is really, really important. It also gives you that ability to form sentences, ask it questions, and give it more context. Because context is something that's really important when working with AI. The more context we can give the models, the better the output's going to be. So we wanted to give you this functionality so that you can code in your natural language, but also be able to translate and communicate better. And this is part of the collaboration piece as well. So those of you that are using GitHub Copilot Chat today and GitHub Copilot are probably using it, I hope, in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. It is available in the JetBrains IDEs as well, but we're going to focus on the Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code experience for you because, after all, this is .NET Conf. So while it's available in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, it's also available in your mobile device. And you may think, well, that's really silly. Why do I need GitHub Copilot Chat there? Because if you're like me and you procrastinate about getting out of bed in the morning, but you want to sit and check all your pull requests or write some code, you can do that from your phone. Or if you're waiting to get on a train or a delayed flight, or you're out walking the dog, GitHub Copilot Chat is with you wherever you go. So it's just a way to get it in your pocket, make you more productive as a developer, and give you that flexibility to work from wherever you need to work from, and that suits you best. So you've heard enough of me talking. Let's get hands-on with the demo. So here I have my repository that is it's a .NET repository with some C# code. And normally we start working in a repository, I would ask you, how do I get started? Now, hopefully you have a README in your repository. In this case, we do have a bit of a README, but doesn't tell us a lot. It doesn't actually tell us what we need to get started, what packages we need to get installed. Now I can see in my GitHub repository, it is using C#, there's some Golang, and there's some infrastructure as code in here, and there's even some JavaScript. And I'm not a great JavaScript developer, so I may need some help with this. So getting started on a project can be really tough. So normally we go to our code button here and we clone this code locally. We would go ahead and copy the URL, clone it, whether we do HTTPS or SSH, connect up, bring the code down. But sometimes that's really prohibitive. So instead of spinning up my code in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, I want to configure a GitHub code space. Now, when we configure this GitHub code space, we're going to do this live and on the fly. So this is internet dependent, and it is a GitHub code space is Visual Studio Code in the cloud. It's in a secure development containerized environment, and we can set parameters and the packages and all the tooling we need installed in right away. So I can work off my main branch. I can choose the region in which to spin up my code space. I'm going to spin up from Europe West, and we can choose our machine type. Because how often as a developer are we given the dusty old machine from the back room and we can't even run tests locally on our machine? So this is going to go ahead and spin up our GitHub code space. Our GitHub code space has spun up successfully. And as you can see, it looks just like Visual Studio Code. So it's an IDE that you're completely familiar with. Now I've loaded up our project. I'm going to go ahead and open up a file that I have working. Let's open up our models file. I'm going to open up the broadcast folder. So I have this broadcast file, and we're going to go ahead and work with this. And it's a project that we haven't worked on before. So to get started, I'm going to go to my top right-hand corner in my IDE. You will see this in both Visual Studio Code and your GitHub code space. And I can open up GitHub Copilot Chat. Now, if you notice, it also gives me the other shortcuts. I can use the editor inline chat, and that's Control I. You can open all the Copilot edits you've had, and you can add a selection or file directly from here. So we've moved the experience out of the left-hand sidebar, and we've put it out to the right-hand side. So here we have GitHub Copilot, and it's referencing the current file. It has the eyeball here. I can disable this. I can also use the paperclip functionality and add my entire code base. I can use the current editor or reference something from the terminal commands or a selection that I may have had. The other thing I can do is I can call in third-party extensions by using the @ symbol. So if you want to use at GitHub, at the workspace, or maybe you want to query something with Azure or another third-party extension, this is where you do it from. Now, also, you can see we have a new feature here in GitHub Copilot Chat. I'm going to make this bigger for everyone. You can change the model that is used. So we recently released the new Gemini and Claude models, and they are available directly in the IDE once you're given access to them. I'm going to use the GPT 4.0, but I also have access to the O1 Mini and the O1 Preview. So now we enable you to look at the different models that are available directly in your IDE experience. Now, when I get started with any project, I will use one of the short commands in GitHub Copilot Chat. Now, these are really helpful. When I hit the / command here, it gives me the option. I can search my code base. I can /explain. I can fix my code. I can fix a text failure, or I can use /test, and that will spit up unit tests. So there are lots of great things here that we can use. So quite often I'll use the /explain, and I'll go ahead and ask GitHub Copilot to explain the existing file. I'm going to zoom out a little bit as we let Copilot work, and let's move this over so we have better visuals. So it's giving us a full rundown of what the file is doing, links to all the different references in the file. So it's really helpful in getting started. Now, I've asked it to explain it to us in just /explain in my natural language, which is English, but I'm going to ask GitHub Copilot to, can you explain this code to me in, let's pick another language, German. So this is where the natural language models are really good. I might speak German fluently. I don't, but let's pretend I do. And I want GitHub Copilot to speak to me in my natural language. So in this case, we're using the reference of our natural language to prompt it, and it's going to return it in that language. Now, I can also look at my code base here that's on this side, and I can notice that we also don't have any tests for our code base. Now, I can use the /test command. So let's see what happens when I do that. So it gives me a plan, it spits out what the code's going to look like, and it lets me either delete it or accept it. Now I go through the test code or the test qualifier, and it's okay. It's split out my assertions. It's used arrange, act, and assert. So that makes me happy. But maybe I wanted to split out our assertions a little bit better. So this is the iteration part of Copilot. So it's given us some tests, but maybe I want to use test-driven design. So it's going to give me it's going to start with the test-driven design, and it's going to give me the broadcast class, and it's going to give me the exact file, the syntax for it, and it's going to write a failing test for us. Now, again, it's put all these assertions together, and it actually is a little less nice than the last file. So this is the iteration part. So I want it to split out. And I'm going to say please. Now, GitHub Copilot is not a sentient being. However, sometimes I find that it gives me what I want when I ask it to be a little bit nicer. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. And also you notice it's using one reference, and it's referencing that file. We can ask it to reference our entire code base or go a little bit further. So we look what it's given us, and let's see what it's done. It's still using arrange, act, and assert, and it's pulled out our assertions in one per line, exactly as we asked for it. It's still generating that file. There we go. And it's split all those assertions out to different test methods. I can go up to the top here. I can open our Copilot edits. We can have a full review of everything we've actually done. I can show the different chats. And actually, I can open the chat editor, put it in a new window, give it some new feedback. But actually, I'm pretty happy with that file. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file for us. I'm going to get all the way to the top. And again, we can insert this into an existing file. We can copy this code over, but I want to insert it into a new file. And this is going to be our test file here in the middle. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'm just going to call it tests. So we've created our test file here. We've asked it to explain our code in our broadcast file. I want to go back to our broadcast file, and I actually want to ask it to add comments to this file because we've added in some tests, but how is the next person going to understand our code? So we've gotten a lot more context here from Copilot, and this is actually a really good place where it explains each line of code. We can be a little bit more descriptive, and I'm going to go ahead and insert that into our code base. Now, this is all good. We've done all the right things, but actually, I want to go ahead and push this code up and see what that looks like from a code space experience. So I'm going to go to my source control. I have the source control add-in. I'm going to commit my code and let's just call it some changes. Now, I want to show you something really cool that we've put into the ability when you're pushing your code up. If you notice here, there's some cool little sparkly bits. I am sure there is, a better phrase for this, but let's generate a commit message with Copilot because I'm really terrible at generating that message. So I'm going to ask Copilot to do that, and it sees that we've enhanced our broadcast model and we've implemented some unit tests. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, the really cool thing is too, as I'm submitting my code, we can see all the pushes that I've had to my main branch. I'm going to go ahead and sync those changes up, and it will go ahead and push those up for me. Now, also, as I push those changes up, I can go to my GitHub Actions and watch how this push on main has kicked off a bunch of automation. I don't have to leave my IDE. So I can see that I pushed my code up. It's going to run some analyzation on the code to check for any security issues. So it already knows that I'm running some C#, Go, and JavaScript, which we saw in the beginning, and I have full ability to see that. Now, the other thing is we can see if we go down here, I know that this is our code QL workflow. I can get more in-depth analyzation and see exactly what part of the steps it's in of each of those workflows. So we have a really good end-to-end view. We're able to send our code up, and it helped us generate a comment for that commit. The other thing I can look in is our pull requests. So when I send my code up, I can see what pull requests I have. I can see what local pull requests per branch, which ones are assigned to me, or which ones are created by me. So again, here I'm having a full pane of glass view example of what's happening. So before we go into the next few bits, I just want to show you a really cool bit. So now often I'm going to use a previous pull request here. We did something really similar. Now I'm going to go into my pull request because we've pushed some changes up. And remember I said some changes. Did you know that over 50% of pull requests have no description at all? So I've used Copilot, I've used the AI to help me name my pull request. And in here, instead of using some changes, now also communication. Sometimes it takes a while to read a pull request. We have to go through the files. I'm going to ask GitHub Copilot to summarize the actions for me. So I'm going to click on the Copilot head, and I can ask it for an outline or a summary. I'm going to go ahead and ask it for a summary for it to tell me what we changed in these files. So with these changes, it's given me a bit of a summary. It sees that we've changed the broadcast model and introduced some new unit tests for it. So with that, we have put in a little bit more of a description to help our reviewer pick those up. So let's go ahead and recap what we just did. Now, we showed off some of the limitations of GitHub Copilot. So you have to remember, the training data impacts the suggestions. Copilot is not a compiler. It is AI, and it cannot read your mind. But I do think sometimes it helps to say, please, it is not a sentient being. So prompts and context are really important. And if it doesn't give what you want the first time, you have to iterate. So be very specific and expect literal responses from it. So we've moved past one prompt at a time. We can now ask it multiple sentences with the new models. We can ask it full paragraphs and get a whole design diagram going forward. So remember to trust but verify. So do some manual code reviews. Run tests. Can you build and do your test pass and run it through your CI/CD system? So while we've seen the single pane of glass view using a GitHub code space, I want to talk about GitHub Copilot Workspace. So here at GitHub, we want to put in a cloud native development environment designed for everyday tasks. Now, when you think about your DevOps lifecycle and how you're developing your code, you have an idea, you have the creation idea, you start planning it, you write your code, you build it, you preview it and deploy it. So if we could do that securely from end to end, and have the help of AI behind it, we've put some pretty big features in that. So let's take a look at that. So it starts with an issue. It starts with communication, what we want to do, and hopefully your team are using something like GitHub Issues to collaborate and communicate. Now, I've created an issue for us. I want to add some testing. So if I click on this issue, I want to run some tests for better accessibility in the interface of my application. I want to add some XUnit tests and some interface assertions with Playwright and maybe mock some of the API. Now, I've used my natural language. I've made in the request. I've given it some steps. And in this case, I'm going to open up my GitHub Copilot workspace. In the GitHub Copilot workspace, I've written my asks of it. It's going to give me a preview and it's going to go ahead and process that. Now, as it processes that, it's going through my code. It's helping me brainstorm some ideas. And with that, it can see the current behavior, it sees the proposed solution, and it gives me some suggested bits. Now, I can also ask it more questions. I can ask it a question, enter a topic, and you can see I can ask it things like, how do I integrate Playwright for interface assertions? What parts of the API should be mocked for testing? So you can take your brainstorm and get more data out of that. You can add items. So while it has proposed a solution, I can add items to that. Now, while it's done that, I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with the output. And then I'm going to ask GitHub Copilot Workspace to generate a plan. So GitHub Copilot Workspace has made a plan on all my different files. I can scroll through them and it's added the different tasks. I can add an item here and there. I can approve it. And when I'm ready, I can implement those selected files. So GitHub Copilot Workspace has gone through and made changes to the files and written us new files. So we can see that we have an accessibility test here in our screen. And if I scroll down, I can go through the different code and I can see we have mock API tests. So it's created these files for us. We can rename them. We want to review them. But some other really cool features are we can open up commands or we can open up a GitHub code space yet again to review what files it has changed for us. We can also open this up in Visual Studio Code. We can also bookmark this for later, and we can also share it. But let's pretend I'm really happy with our code. I'm going to go ahead and create a pull request. It's given us a branch name. I want to call it .net, and it's given us a title and a description. Now, remember, we're not always good at, creating descriptions and naming things. So I'm going to go ahead and generate this description and see what it comes up with. And we can see that it's given us a description. I can also select that it fixes our issue. Sure. And then let's create the pull request and see what that ends up as. So here we go. We've gone from opening a GitHub code space to a net new repository, making changes, pushing those up. We've then started with some ideas, started in a workspace this time, made the changes, and much more quickly, and more easily made some file changes, was able to generate a PR, add some notes, documentation. We can even ask GitHub Copilot to review it. Now, I'm going to caveat this. While GitHub Copilot for pull requests is absolutely amazing, and I highly recommend you give it a try once you get access to it, asking it to request something that it has generated entirely is going to tell you that it hasn't found any issues for it. So if I go ahead and hit Request Copilot to Review, we can see the orange dot here. It's going to review the code, but since it generated it, it's pretty much going to tell us it found no issues. So we can see that it's running here, and all those automation bits that we have are also running. Now, again, we can open this up in a GitHub in a GitHub code space, see the changes, make more changes. But for right now, it's running all the tests, running through our pipelines, and it's running GitHub Copilot on the pull request itself. So we can see that GitHub Copilot has reviewed our pull requests. And as I promised, it's not going to generate any suggestions because it already generated the request for us. But if you're using a pull request that you as a human have produced, it will certainly find a lot of suggestions that will help you better your code. So let's go back to our slides now and finish talking about a few things. So I talked a little bit about GitHub Copilot extensions. So when I'm working in my IDE, The reality is you're not just going to use GitHub Copilot. You want to use other extensions. So we have built Copilot extensions into the workspace that you're using. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and query data stacks, and I can query it how the data is performing, select the code in my repository, and improve that performance from the third-party extension. In another instance here, I'm going to go ahead and call launch darkly, and I'm going to ask it to report on my feature flags, which is basically just an if statement, but I want to know if it's being used or not. And another great one is Postman. Does the implementation match our documentation? So I can query Postman. It will put out the outputs. And I'm doing this all from within that IDE environment because we know you just don't work in one single browser. So I've talked a bit about Copilot today. So really important things to do as you're learning and getting involved with using Copilot, deeper dives into it. It's no longer just single line queries and tabbing through. You're able to have that natural language. You're able to deliver from beginning to end using AI to help you in that process, especially with communication, collaboration, and automation. So use it. Build an internal community with where you're working and your peers and share those tips and tricks. And there's going to be some really surprising moments. There's things that you find GitHub Copilot will do really well with .NET, might actually help you be able to convert TypeScript into C#. And I can tell you I've done that. And it's pretty cool because we've often taken on legacy projects. But the most important thing is iterate, iterate, iterate. Don't always just accept the default. Iterate what it outputs, test it, and verify. So there's a lot of questions around GitHub Copilot and security. We have the GitHub Copilot Trust Center. So if you go to this link, you can look at all the compliance and security questions and also learn. We have tons of interactive courses and learning pathways. So have a look at some of these. Links and get involved learning about GitHub courses. We've just released a new GitHub Copilot certification as well recently. So it's definitely worth your time to get certified, learn the administration side, learn the security side, learn the actions, and learn and get certified with GitHub Copilot. So thank you all for listening today, and we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to some questions and enjoy the rest of your conference.